Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another installment of APAICS In Conversation. This week, we are featuring Konrad Ng and Hoyt Zia as our moderator. Konrad is the executive director of the Shangri in Honolulu, Hawaii, a museum for learning about global culture of Islamic art and design through exhibitions, digital media, educational initiatives, public tours and programs, and community partnerships. Our moderator for today is Hoyt Zia, who is the founding president of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. He recently retired as a senior VP, general counsel, and corporate secretary for Hawaiian Airlines Incorporated. Hoyt, I kick it off to you.
Thanks, Anthony. So what we're here to talk about today is a subject near and dear to everybody's heart, which is, or whether they know it or not, and if it isn't, it will be once they hear from Konrad, and that's about museums and Asian Americans in particular. By way of quick background, I'm not here in connection with anything actually that I've done in my career so much as that I was board chair for the Chinese Historical Society, which has the oldest Chinese American museum in the country in San Francisco for a few years and stepped off last year. But in that process, I had the great pleasure and privilege of meeting Konrad about 2 years ago to talk about some museum projects that we were working on. And although I've only had the pleasure of knowing him for a couple of years, I feel like I've known him for a really long time because he's such a cool guy. And I really jumped at this chance to participate in this conversation because it gave me an opportunity to do something that I haven't had the chance to do, which is actually find out more about him. I mean, Konrad typically doesn't like to talk about himself, but he's going to be forced to do so because I'm going to ask him about him. But mostly we want to focus on his work and his views about the future of museums and their development. Now, you may not, it may surprise you to know that as you look at Konrad now, and he looks just like any other cool Hawaiian surfer dude, that actually, you know, he's a relatively recent newcomer, not just to Hawaii, but to the US. He has his own immigrant story. And I must say, Konrad, for a recent immigrant, relatively speaking, you speak English pretty well. I was wondering if you would talk to us a little bit about your background and your interesting immigrant story.
Hoyt, thank you for that kind introduction. And I have such aloha for you, having a chance to have gotten to work with you as we have over the last couple of years. And I'm grateful that we have this conversation to get to know each other, at least in this forum. I'm grateful to APAICS for this opportunity. Madeline, Anthony, Joyce, thank you for your work. It's terrific. I used to be in Washington and at the Smithsonian, and I do miss the proximity to the Capitol, the opportunity to participate in processes and our government and the vibrancy of America in order to make positive change. And Hawaii is, in my mind, still the center of the universe in lots of ways. But Washington, D.C.'s got this appeal because it really reminds you that citizens who love this country have this capacity to change things and make things for the better. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak to everyone here. And also Vince, who has helped with Hoyt to get me into this forum, much to my sort of reluctance, because a lot of the other speakers I felt had real accomplishments, whereas my PhD was, an honorific that I felt wasn't on par with some of the other speakers. So I'm grateful and thank you. I appreciate how Hoyt has, set me up this way. But it is, I think, lovely because one is with our comfort with each other, with Hoyt to say, oh, I speak English very well. It is a reminder of kind of, the challenges that I think Asian Pacific Americans have in this country. And that's being understood within the context of how we find our identity, which is not only just through citizenship, but through culture, right? So we experience citizenship culturally. You know, and that came to me quite early in my life. You know, my parents were born in Malaysia. Actually, it was still Borneo, a colony of the British, you know, after World War II became Malaysia. And then they immigrated to Canada, where I was born. And early on, what they believed as a home and a country that welcomed them because they were able to change their passport, you know, soon gave into some of the reality that the people who are around you may not recognize you as being part of the story just yet. And since I was born in Canada, I had this sense of belonging because I was born into this world and therefore I do belong to it. And so that dynamic between articulating how and recognizing how I may not feel like I belong, but yet trying to reconcile that with the sense of knowing that I belong has animated my work in understanding the importance of inclusivity and the recognition of Asian Pacific American experiences. So I did, you know, a few bits of work there in Canada, but as Hoyt mentioned, there was a moment in my mid-20s where after I had been working with young people, I was a youth worker for a few years, well, for a couple years working with young people. I had finished my master's degree, I'd finished my bachelor's, and I wasn't sure where or what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was looking, as any good immigrant son, to you know, stay in school. And that's in part because I didn't have a sense of service like APAICS encourages. I had a sense of that immigrant story, which is, you know, make money quick. Maybe you should be a lawyer. Maybe you should be a doctor. And I can fully understand that because my parents really did work hard to give me opportunities, which I'm ever grateful for. But I was kind of idling in life, and I realized, well, I'll go to school. So I applied to a few PhD programs, and one was at the University of Hawaii. And I applied to a PhD in political science here because there's some very interesting work being done in the politics of identity and race, which I thought was, again, something that could further this ongoing dynamic that I had felt about, you know, this idea of the importance of belonging, yet knowing I belong. And although all of my friends in Canada said, you're not going for your PhD, you're going for 75 degrees because the weather is quantifiably better than, I think, the coldest days in Canada. And so that's where I ended up, was here in Hawaii and making this place home. And not only is it home in a way in which I found my story reflected in the institutions around me, whether it was in textbooks, whether it was in government, whether it was even on the TV or in film and media, because Hawaii, with its diversity, is very much a true Asian Pacific American story. It also sharpened kind of my idea of what citizenship could mean, because I stepped into a world in which I could see myself belonging, but I could also see the issues and challenges of those who still have yet to feel that level of recognition. So Native Hawaiians and the types of struggles for recognition that they were articulating, restoring their culture, restoring government, and demonstrating a resilience wrapped up in aloha, I found quite powerful in thinking about empowering everyday people to work at improving this place. So, you know, Hawaii had become home. It became home because I felt comfortable here. And it also felt like home because I realized that I belong, but in a way in which I needed to work at it. I needed to allow more people to feel how I felt and to enjoy the privileges and access that I did. So that's kind of how it happened. And then I got married, you know, to a lovely woman, and then became a U.S. citizen a few years later after that. So in a nutshell, that's kind of part of my backstory.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at more of the museum. Let's segue into the museum part of it now. I mean, I know that in your career, you started as a professor at UH in creative media. And since then, you've had some really significant positions in the museum world. I mean, from there, I believe you went to the Honolulu Museum of Modern Art, and there to the Smithsonian, and of course from there to Shangri-La with the Doris Duke Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about how you move from one place to the other? From professor at UH to the Honolulu Museum of Modern Art and so on.
Yeah, I mean, what my PhD was for me was a vehicle to articulate and understand the cultural power of representation. So I was studying representation and how marginalized communities could use technology such as film, video, and digital media to create a world in which belonging was intrinsic to their identity. So, many of us can recognize that the Asian Pacific American experience is not readily accessible or available in textbooks or even in museums. But if we look at the rich tradition of filmmaking, Asian America is alive and well. And so in that work, I found opportunities to think about representation. Where and how do we experience Asian Pacific America? Who is telling the story, and what does it have to say about power and history and achievement and resilience and the like? And so I actually started during my when I was finishing my PhD, first at the Honolulu Museum of Art as a curator of film and video. And I just before that was working at the Hawaii International Film Festival. And those were just lovely opportunities to curate films which captured those experiences from marginalized bodies and communities to say, okay, how do we, if we can, center them to create these opportunities for empathy for people who may not ordinarily encounter these communities or Asian Pacific Americans or even fully understand it, but could, through this universal language of representation, really find an understanding of the other. And so that's how I started out, was working in film. And I love film. I love teaching film even to this day. And there was an opportunity as I was curator of film and video at the Honolulu Museum of Art to join as a faculty member in this new upstart, really cool program called the Academy for Creative Media. And the whole idea of the ACM was to allow people, particularly young people here in Hawaii, to tell their own story. Similar to what I just mentioned, there just wasn't enough storytellers. There was plenty of stories, but not enough storytellers. And not because no one had a voice, but because no one had an opportunity to have access to resources. And so that's what the ACM was about. It's like, if we put the camera in the hands of someone who was born and raised in Hawaii, let's listen to their powerful story. So that was just terrific to work with young filmmakers talking about the history and art and culture of Asian Pacific America. And I spent a few years teaching at the University of Hawaii in the ACM. But then I got this call to, first of all, be a visiting professor at this program called the Asian Pacific American Program at the Smithsonian, who was founded by a guy also from Hawaii named Franklin Odo, who's one of the coolest cats I've ever met. And he invited me to spend some time with the program to do some research and continue working as I had been on these issues of representation. After I completed some time at the APAP, the Asian Pacific American Program, Franklin retired, and they were looking for a director for the program. They asked if I'd wanted to be acting director, because I was able to, sort of bring together scholarship at the University of Hawaii and then museum experience. And so I think they thought that I would be an okay person to mind the shop, because I wouldn't mess things up. But it turns out it was something that I really, truly wanted to do. And I was so grateful to have gone through the interview process and had this opportunity to lead then the Asian Pacific American Program. And I spent a few years there and helped, basically my mission was to deepen the institutionalization of the Asian Pacific American experience at our national museum system. And so, we did a number of things that were, firsts. We were able to rename the program into a center, the Asian Pacific American Center, reflecting its institutionalization in the, and its longevity in the Smithsonian system, which is like, some 20 or so museums and, 7 or 8 research centers. Was able to create establish the first curators of the Asian Pacific American experience at the Smithsonian. So prior to that, there was, no one, looking at how we could actively recognize, our experiences within the collections and exhibitions at the Smithsonian. We launched the Homespun project and turned out into, which, focused on the Indian American experience with the exhibition Beyond Bollywood. We did the first Pan-Asian Pacific American experience exhibition with help from the Kellogg Foundation called I Want the Wide American Earth, and that traveled across the country. We did Asian Pacific show with the National Portrait Gallery, focusing on portraiture of Asian Pacific Americans, called Portraiture Now, Asian Pacific American Encounters. So we did several things there, which I found amazing. But like with all experiences from people from Hawaii, there's this desire to return. And I had this tremendous and amazing experience in Washington, feeling like I was changing the world every day when, in the sense of, there's someone can go to the National Museum of American History and see elements of collections that showcase the Chinese American experience through Chinese food, which is like an American staple, yet there had been nothing there to help understand America through that experience. It's great to imagine that my daughters would be able to go there and understand that. But after some time in Washington at the Smithsonian, I just felt this pull to come back to Hawaii. I wanted to rejoin the fabric of this place that I call home. I wanted to, join the ohana, which is Hawaiian for family, of people that I respected and admired and had felt passionate about making Hawaii the best place it could be. And so I had this opportunity to return to Hawaii as the executive director of Shangri Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design. And it's been an amazing experience coming back and leading this institution, working with communities that are familiar with me, as well as learning from communities, who feel similar to the ones that I've mentioned for Asian Pacific Americans, attached to canonizing their experience and recognizing and acknowledging the value of that as part of an American story. So that's where I am now. I also have a better view. I look at the beach, which is great because before I used to look at the Virginia Railway Express at Capitol Gallery, for some people who know Washington, D.C. So I don't see the commuters, I see surfers, which I have to tell you is an upgrade from there.
No, thanks, Konrad. Your work at the Smithsonian, I think, probably gave you more opportunity than and a perspective that many people would be curious about in terms of more of a national presence for Asian American Pacific Islander history at a national level. One would think it would start at the Smithsonian, but one of the reasons that you and I were able to get together was to talk about how we, quite apart from the Smithsonian, could create more of a national presence. I mean, perhaps even a national museum, regarding Asian American history. We have a great museum. Probably the best known one is the Japanese American National Museum. And there's talk perhaps about creating something, at a national level. I don't know if it'll approach the National African American History Museum of History, National Museum of African Culture and History, but perhaps some greater attention. Can you talk a little bit about where that effort is, and also your perspective on museums generally and their importance and how they need to be nurtured and developed, especially as we go through, looking in the future and how the pandemic now may be helping direct that effort?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think I came to appreciate, and I think others would as well, can be summed up that, we come to recognize that, America is this amazing, brilliant country, but it's also a long-term project. That change takes so much effort and commitment. And sometimes at the end of the day, the change is small. And I think our metabolism these days is for fast change, things need to happen quickly. What I want now. Being at the Smithsonian, I think, taught me and reminded me that the levers that we can work, no matter how big they are or how small they are, we work them towards positive change and inclusion, and it's a long-term thing. So at the Smithsonian, being able to institutionalize the experiences of Asian Pacific Americans who have contributed to building this country, to accomplishments and sacrifices, from the boardroom to the classroom, from the battlefield to to the streets. It takes a long time to begin to seed those forms of knowledge, whether it's in collections or policy, for them to grow. And doing things such as adding the Asian Pacific American Center into a congressional board book, which is something that the Smithsonian, submits to each Congress, for example, is an ongoing archive of our presence. And when it wasn't there, we don't exist in the records of Congress. But when it is created, so being able to contribute in this way that very few people would generally pick up and read, except for legislative staffers and congressional folks, being able to introduce that language gives footing for bills and laws and the like that Congress will implement. So, for example, the National Museum of African American History and Culture was something that took like 100 years or so to build. It was an idea that had taken such a long time. And it was something in which the language had to be developed. And, people were born, raised, and died not thinking that this essential part of the American story would ever become a reality. But through the work of introducing bills and laws to be able to make that happen, to make the study happen, takes a long time. And it begins with people in all positions, making small adjustments, such as adding language into congressional books. So great, Representative Grace Meng, who introduced, House Bill for a commission to study the creation of a potential National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture. It's sitting in subcommittee, land, which means it will probably expire, because this congressional term will expire, and that's how these these bills may languish. But it's the building block for a conversation that is a long-term project. And each successive, generation of Asian Pacific Americans, each Congress, et cetera, this is the language from which they and we can draw from to say, we matter, we belong, and this is how a museum can be built. So I think the part of my experience at sort of sitting where I had been as director of the Asian Pacific American Center at the Smithsonian was laying the groundwork for successive generations, people who are hopefully on the Zoom, who may find what I'm trying to say, perhaps quite clumsily, a set of values that they feel America should aspire to in its museums and its understanding of cultural patrimony. And my hope is that I've been able to lay some of the groundwork so that they, when they pick up something that was introduced, by, say, for example, Congresswoman Meng, or found in the work of the Smithsonian, they see that as something, as a building block, so that my kids or my kids' kids can realize the fruit from the seeds that hopefully we've been able to plant, and they've turned into trees, so that we can open a museum, or we can see monuments and other forms of recognition of Asian Pacific Americans and how we've made America how it is today.
Konrad, we only have a few more minutes before we should start taking questions. No, from the audience, but I think it's important to hear your thoughts as really one of the leading Asian American museum guys, in the country, if not the world, to talk about museums generally. What is the future of museums? What can we do to help develop them? What would you like to see going forward?
Oh, I think that museums are powerful institutions, especially these days, as our traditional forms of places of authority, like we look to Congress or the White House. There's sort of seems to be a greater level of either distrust or division, and museums have stepped up to be this firewall for democracy. People will go into museums wanting to learn and expecting to learn, and that the knowledge that they receive is ones in which will improve their understanding or deepen their understanding of the world. Museums have to weigh in. We are the safeguards for citizens, right? We're the safeguards for learning. We're the safeguards for civic culture. We're the safeguards for just anybody, any Joe or Jane, anybody or everybody can come in and learn. And it can encounter an experience that they may not know themselves, or may they want to, or they will discover. And that could lead someone to a different path. I've always found that museums is a one touch point. We sometimes talk about touch points. If we can be a touch point for somebody for 1 degree of change in their life, over time, that 1 degree, if you map it out longitudinally, could be impressive. We can be cultivating the next president of the United States, and that he or she, well, she will be able to understand America because she went into a museum and found herself there, or discovered something about someone else that resonated with her. Museums got to step up. We are called upon to safeguard democracy and our values.
Okay, thanks, Konrad, for that. Let me refocus on something you were talking about, but that the audience, I think, as you might expect, an APAICS audience to be very interested in really Asian Pacific American museums and where they're going. So let me just, we've got about 3 questions here, which kind of touch on the same thing. Can you speak about a little bit more about the outlook for creating an Asian Pacific American museum, either within the Smithsonian or, should Grace Meng's bill see the light, make it through and actually become a law and a commission established? What do you see the prospects of creating and the challenges of creating a national Asian Pacific American museum, on the Mall or elsewhere?
Yeah. It's the same work that we're doing right now. I think everyone's doing right now in terms of this election. America doesn't change every 4 years. America can be changed every day. And it means going to Congress and talking to your congresswoman or congressman and saying, this is important to me. Right? If you don't say that, if you don't make that effort to care for democracy, to build America, then it goes on without us. It goes on without you. So the prospects are in our hands. And as I mentioned earlier, there are people like Representative Meng, there are people like you, Hoyt, there's people like Madeline, there are people like APAICS, there's people like, Norman Mineta, Daniel Noy, all these folks who have laid out a path for us, but, they are expecting, and we should expect, to carry forward and move forward. So it's up to us. I see it as a possibility. That's if other people see it as a possibility too. And I have tried and contributed in the ways in which I had the opportunity to at the Smithsonian. But it's really up to someone in this audience, I think, who has, expressed an interest in APAICS, who has, part of this amazing initiative that was founded like in the early 90s. You folks are the people that I'll be voting for or watching or knowing, and making decisions that will have a profound effect on myself or my children and the like. And I'm so excited because I that's what America is the possibility of the people who are on the Zoom call. And that's why I'm happy to be speaking, having this opportunity, because my hope is that I can remind, or at least remind folks of something that I learned when I first came to Hawaii, was that you have power, you have mana to change the world around you. But it takes work, it takes some sweat. And you may not get as far as you want, but there's going to be someone behind you to keep it going.
Okay, thanks, Konrad. We're nearing the witching hour and I've enjoyed listening to all that you've had to share. And so there's two questions left that I have to ask with the time we have left. One is the most curious thing, which is noted, I think, in the description of this interview, which is that in an alternative reality or alternative life, you would be a competitive eater. Now, I mean, I love hot dogs, but I can't imagine eating 70 of them in 2 minutes. How would you see that career, and possibly in the future, maybe there's more, but how do you see that taking shape and why?
Well, I think it's funny, I actually just realized this now, this with this question was, my parents were raised during World War II, right? So they didn't, in Asia, so they had nothing, right? They were under occupation during war. And so my father would eat anything, even if it's expired, right? So, and he would say, make sure you, and I'm sure this resonates with people. It's like, make sure you eat everything on your plate. The cleaner your plate, the more beautiful your spouse will be. And I'd say, really, Dad? And he would say, look at your mom. And what's the son to do? You're like, yeah, my mom's gorgeous. And so I think I was encouraged to eat because, and I developed this capacity, to carry forth my father's own experiences. And yeah, I could throw down. I mean, I enjoy eating. It's a pleasure. And yeah, I've been known to surprise a few people with how much I could fit in my body.
Yeah, I've been, the same has been said about me, actually, in terms of how much I can eat. But again, I've never dreamed of entering that world. The last question, the hallmark question for these APAICS in Conversation is about leadership. And you've been in positions of significant positions of leadership. What is your, what would you have to say about the leadership resiliency? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a fabulous question. This year more than ever has really called upon us understanding ourselves and our strength, our sense of resilience. A pandemic, wildfires, isolation, loss, tension, racial, political tension, Black Lives Matter movements calling for racial justice, and it's asked us to really think about where are we in the world and who do we want to be. And I think resilience as a leader comes down to a sense of empathy and self-confidence about understanding other people, trying to center the concerns and worries of others as your own. And when you understand that the people who are around you are just, are pretty much the same as you, that you try to find that common ground, I think it helps with developing that strength, that opportunity to talk, to understand that you're not alone. And I think resilience, at least for me, has been trying to be active in that sense of empathy, in understanding other people's experiences, and trying to be purposeful about how we can create a better world by being empathetic and centering people's worries, and also recognizing their accomplishments and happiness, their firsts, if you're the first in your family to get a degree. I was the first in my mother didn't graduate from college. My father had a graduate degree. And so it was really, but a master's degree, but it was really significant for them to have a son who would get a PhD. But using that experience for understanding others who might be going to school for the first time, and understanding that school is something that everyone should be able to participate in. Or if I've had to care with my father for, his own health. And that again is an opportunity for empathy to understand healthcare for other people, how scary it is to need to care for your kapuna, your elders, without having the resources to support. Resilience is about finding that purpose to center a world in which more people are included and recognized for their value.
Thanks, Konrad. Let me just say at this point in wrapping up our conversation, how much of a pleasure it's been to be talking with you again. And to that, I also would add the thanks that you started with to APAICS and Madeline for bringing us together and making this possible. So back to APAICS.
Yeah, thank you, Hoyt. And when I first met you, I thought, man, what a cool dude. Yeah. I can't even grow that mustache either, but you're tall, good looking, athletic. I mean, why wouldn't I not want to grow up to be like you?
Yeah, you have a long ways to go. In terms of years, you're already there. It's surpass whatever I've done. But we look forward to seeing more of and having more of these conversations in the future with you, Konrad. Anthony.
Thank you so much, Hoyt and Konrad. It's been a pleasure having you both on APAICS in Conversation. It's really important. I see a lot of parallels between your work with the Shangri-La, the music, the work you've done at the Smithsonian, and the parallels that we're all fighting for that representation, trying to build the AAPI story and tell it accurately to our constituency. So I really appreciate all the work that you've done for AAPIs and what you've done at the Smithsonian. Hoyt, thank you again for moderating today. It was a real pleasure working with you. And just a little subtle plug here for our next APAICS in Conversation. It'll be Wednesday, October 21st at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It'll be featuring former immigration judge, the Honorable J. Tracy Hong. So please tune in. You can always register at apaics.org/programs/conversation. Thank you again for your participation today, and I look forward to communicating with you all in the future.